It was an ordinary night when the protagonists found themselves slipping into an unusually deep sleep. The room was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. As they slept, a strange sensation crept into their subconscious, a feeling of being watched. The dream began subtly, with the faint sound of a door creaking open. The protagonist, still partially asleep, felt their heart quicken. In the dream, they were lying in bed just as they were in reality, and the sense of something being wrong grew stronger. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the dream. It was shadowy and indistinct, more a silhouette than a person, but undeniably there. The figure moved slowly down the hallway, a silent and deliberate approach toward the protagonist's bedroom. The protagonist felt a rising panic, a primal fear that gripped them as the figure drew closer. They tried to scream, to call out for help, but no sound came out. It was as if their voice had been stolen, leaving them voiceless in the face of this unknown intruder. The figure paused at the foot of the bed, a dark, looming presence that seemed to consume the light around it. The protagonist could feel the weight of its gaze, an icy chill that seeped into their bones. In a moment that stretched into eternity, the figure leaned closer, its form still blurry and undefined, yet overwhelmingly menacing. The protagonist's mind screamed in terror, but their body remained frozen, trapped between the world of sleep and wakefulness. Just as the figure reached out towards them, the protagonist jolted awake, gasping for breath. The room was as they had left it, silent and still, the only sound their own ragged breathing. For a moment they lay there, heart pounding, trying to convince themselves that it had only been a nightmare. But the vividness of the dream, the intensity of the fear, and the clarity of the shadowy figure made it hard to dismiss. They sat up in bed, eyes scanning the room for any signs of the intruder, but found nothing. The door was closed, the apartment was quiet, yet the sense of unease lingered, a dark whisper at the edges of their consciousness. As the protagonist sat up in bed, heart still racing, they tried to shake off the remnants of the nightmare. The room was familiar and ordinary, a stark contrast to the vivid terror they had just experienced. They took deep breaths, grounding themselves in the reality of their surroundings, the soft rustle of the sheets, the faint hum of the city outside, the gentle glow of the alarm clock on the nightstand. It had only been a dream, they told themselves, just a product of an overactive imagination. However, the unease refused to dissipate. The dream had felt disturbingly real, each detail etched vividly in their memory. The sensation of being unable to scream, the sight of the shadowy figure standing at the foot of their bed, and the chilling sense of dread that had gripped them, all lingered, as if imprinted on their psyche. The protagonist rubbed their eyes, trying to banish the images, but they persisted, a haunting afterimage in their mind. They glanced around the room again, more carefully this time, searching for any signs of something amiss. Yet, the feeling of being watched remained, a subtle but pervasive sensation that made their skin prickle. Rationality struggled to assert itself. The protagonist reasoned that nightmares were often vivid and unsettling, a natural response to stress or anxiety. They had read about sleep paralysis before, a phenomenon where a person upon waking finds themselves unable to move, often accompanied by hallucinations. Perhaps that was all it had been, a nightmare intensified by a brief episode of sleep paralysis. They repeated this to themselves, trying to find comfort in the explanation. But the doubt lingered. The clarity of the dream was unlike anything they had ever experienced. They rarely remembered their dreams, yet this one was crystal clear, every detail sharp and precise. The figure, though indistinct, had seemed almost real, as if it existed in a space between the dream world and reality. The protagonist shivered, unable to shake the feeling that the boundary between their nightmares and waking life had somehow been breached. They lay back down, pulling the covers tightly around them, and closed their eyes. Sleep was elusive, their mind replaying the events of the dream over and over. The shadowy figure, the creeping sense of dread, the paralysis, it all felt too real to dismiss. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and they drifted into a fitful sleep. But the unease remained, lurking in the corners of their mind, waiting to resurface. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room, but the protagonist felt none of its comfort. They awoke with a start, the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to their consciousness. Groggy and disoriented, they stumbled out of bed and headed to the bathroom, trying to shake off the heavy sense of dread that had settled over them. As they splashed cold water on their face, the events of the previous night replayed in their mind. The shadowy figure, the inability to scream, the overwhelming fear, it all felt too real. Despite their attempts to rationalize it, the vividness of the dream made it hard to dismiss. They glanced at their reflection in the mirror, their eyes haunted and tired, a stark contrast to their usual self. Determined to move on, the protagonist began their morning routine. They dressed, made a quick breakfast, and gathered their belongings for work. As they reached for their keys, a nagging thought tugged at their mind. Something felt off, a small but persistent sense that something wasn't right. They brushed it aside, chalking it up to lingering anxiety from the nightmare. It wasn't until they reached the front door that the true horror of the situation hit them. The door was slightly ajar, the lock unturned. A cold wave of fear washed over them as they stared at the door, the implications sinking in. They had been sure to lock it the night before, a habit ingrained in them for years. Yet now, it stood open, as if inviting them to question their own reality. Panic surged through them as they quickly inspected the apartment. Nothing seemed out of place, no signs of forced entry, no missing items, but the open door was undeniable evidence that something had happened. The dream and the real world had collided in a way that defied explanation, leaving the protagonist grappling with a terrifying uncertainty. The mind raced through possibilities. Had someone actually entered their apartment while they slept? Had the shadowy figure from their dream been real, or was it a manifestation of something more sinister? The rational explanations they had clung to the night before seemed flimsy in the face of this chilling discovery. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, the protagonist hurried out of the apartment, locking the door behind them. As they made their way to work, their thoughts remained clouded with fear and confusion. They replayed the events over and over, searching for any detail that might provide clarity, but found none. The morning commute, usually a routine part of their day, felt surreal and distant. Every stranger on the street seemed like a potential threat, every shadow a hiding place for unseen eyes. The protagonist's paranoia grew, fueled by the inexplicable events of the night. They arrived at work in a state of heightened alertness, struggling to focus on their tasks. Throughout the day, the open door and the vivid dream haunted them. They could feel the thin veil between their waking life and their nightmares growing ever more fragile, and the fear that something or someone was watching them from the shadows refused to be ignored. As the day wore on, the protagonist found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. The open door, the vivid nightmare, and the strange sense of being watched gnawed at their mind. They tried to focus on their work, but every time they closed their eyes, they saw the shadowy figure looming at the foot of their bed. The memory was so clear that it felt less like a dream and more like a suppressed memory fighting its way to the surface. During lunch, the protagonist sat with colleagues, but their usual conversations felt distant and irrelevant. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that went beyond the nightmare. The open door was a tangible reminder that there had been a breach of their home, their safety, their sense of reality. It was an unsettling violation that left them feeling exposed and vulnerable. Throughout the day, the protagonists' unease grew. They found themselves frequently glancing over their shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure lurking just out of sight. The rational part of their mind knew it was impossible, yet the fear was visceral, deeply ingrained in their psyche. They avoided dark corners and empty hallways, feeling a constant pressure at the back of their neck, as if being watched by unseen eyes. As evening approached, the protagonists debated whether to go home. The thought of returning to the apartment filled them with dread. What if the figure returned? What if the door was open again? They considered staying with a friend or booking a hotel room, but dismissed the ideas as impractical. They needed to face this fear, confront whatever it was that haunted them. Back at the apartment, they hesitated at the door, the key trembling in their hand. They took a deep breath and unlocked the door, half expecting to find something or someone waiting inside. But the apartment was empty, quiet, and still. They carefully checked each room, their heart pounding, but found no signs of intrusion. Yet the sense of being watched persisted, an invisible presence that seemed to hover in the shadows. The protagonists tried to distract themselves by watching TV, but every creak and groan of the building made them jump. The night stretched on, filled with the oppressive weight of fear and uncertainty. When it was finally time for bed, the protagonist felt a knot of anxiety tighten in their chest. They double-checked the locks, ensuring everything was secure. But as they lay in the dark, the familiar sense of dread settled over them. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by moments of startling wakefulness, as if they were on the verge of seeing something just beyond the edge of perception. In the quiet darkness, the protagonist's thoughts churned. They wondered if they were losing their grip on reality, if the figure from their dream was a symptom of something deeper, a hidden fear, a repressed memory, or perhaps something supernatural. The fear of the unknown, the uncertainty of their own mind, kept them awake long into the night, their eyes wide open, staring into the shadows. The days following the nightmare were a blur of anxiety and growing obsession. The protagonist, unable to shake the sense of dread that clung to them, turned to the internet for answers. They started researching sleep paralysis, hoping to find an explanation for the terrifying experience. They read countless articles and forum posts, discovering that many people had reported similar encounters, waking to see shadowy figures, feeling paralyzed, unable to speak or move. The phenomenon was often explained as a natural occurrence, a misalignment of the brain's sleep cycle. This provided some comfort, but not enough to quell the nagging fear that what they had experienced was more than just a trick of the mind. The protagonists' research soon veered into the realm of the supernatural. They stumbled upon stories of shadow people, dark, humanoid figures, often seen during sleep paralysis episodes. Some believed these entities were malevolent spirits or interdimensional beings. The protagonists found themselves drawn to these theories, despite their initial skepticism. The idea that something otherworldly could have entered their home, crossed the boundary between dreams and reality, resonated with the lingering sense of violation they felt. As they delved deeper, the protagonist's paranoia began to escalate. They started to question every sound, every shadow in their apartment. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the flickering of lights, all became potential signs of a supernatural presence. They found themselves checking the locks multiple times a night, keeping the lights on, and avoiding dark corners. Sleep became increasingly elusive, with every creak and whisper in the night feeding their growing fear. The obsession with understanding the nightmare and the open door led them to seek out stories from others who had experienced similar phenomena. They joined online communities dedicated to the paranormal, sharing their story and reading others. While some stories offered reassurance that these experiences were not uncommon, others only fueled their fear, describing encounters that had escalated over time, sometimes with dire consequences. The protagonist began to feel a creeping sense of isolation. Friends and family noticed their anxiety but were dismissive, chalking it up to stress or an overactive imagination. This lack of understanding only deepened the protagonist's sense of alienation, reinforcing the belief that they were dealing with something beyond the ordinary. They stopped discussing the events with others, fearing ridicule or disbelief, and instead threw themselves deeper into their research. In their search for answers, the protagonist also explored practical measures. They considered installing security cameras, not only to catch potential intruders, but also to document any strange occurrences. The idea of capturing evidence of the shadowy figure both terrified and intrigued them, proof that what they had experienced was real, that they were not losing their mind. The combination of sleepless nights, constant vigilance, and the overwhelming fear of the unknown took a toll on the protagonist's mental state. They became hypervigilant, jumping at every noise, their nerves frayed. The once familiar apartment felt alien and hostile, a place where the lines between reality and nightmare had blurred. They were trapped in a cycle of fear and obsession, unable to find peace or clarity. As the days turned into weeks, the protagonist realized that they could no longer live in a state of perpetual fear. They needed answers, a resolution to the terrifying uncertainty that had taken over their life. The sense of unease that had settled over the protagonist's life soon began to manifest in strange, inexplicable ways. It started with small things. Objects in the apartment seemed to move on their own. A book left on the coffee table would be found on a different shelf. A set of keys moved from their usual spot. At first, the protagonist dismissed these as lapses in memory or simple forgetfulness. But as the occurrences grew more frequent, the pattern became hard to ignore. One particularly unsettling incident happened late at night. The protagonist was preparing for bed when they heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the kitchen. The noise was persistent, like a fingernail lightly drumming on a hard surface. Steeling themselves, they walked towards the source of the sound, their heart pounding in their chest. When they reached the kitchen, the noise abruptly stopped. The room was empty, and nothing seemed out of place, yet the sense of being watched was palpable. They stood frozen in the doorway, scanning the room for any sign of movement, but found nothing. The tapping did not resume, leaving them with a heightened sense of paranoia. Another night, the protagonist awoke to a cold draft sweeping through the bedroom. Groggily, they noticed the window was slightly open, the curtains fluttering gently in the breeze. This struck them as odd, as they distinctly remembered closing and locking the window before bed. They got up to shut it, but as they reached out, a sudden chill ran down their spine, a feeling of an unseen presence standing just behind them. The protagonist spun around, but the room was empty, bathed in the dim light of the moon. The sense of a presence, however, lingered, a heavy weight that pressed down on their chest, making it hard to breathe. These events were not limited to nighttime. During the day, the protagonist began to notice more subtle phenomena. There were occasional cold spots in the apartment, areas where the temperature dropped noticeably despite the warmth of the season. Electrical appliances would flicker or malfunction, sometimes even shutting off unexpectedly. The protagonist's phone, normally reliable, started to glitch, with calls dropping and messages appearing unreadable. The most disturbing incident occurred while the protagonist was home alone one evening. They were watching television when the screen abruptly switched off, plunging the room into darkness. Before they could react, the lights flickered and then went out entirely, leaving them in pitch black. Panic surged as they fumbled for their phone to use its flashlight. Just as they managed to turn it on, the television and lights flickered back to life, casting the room in a harsh, glaring light. On the screen, the channels had changed to static, a low, crackling sound filling the silence. The protagonist stared at the screen, heart racing, before quickly turning everything off and retreating to their bedroom. These strange occurrences fed the protagonist's growing paranoia. They began keeping a journal, meticulously noting each incident in an attempt to find a pattern or explanation. The fear of being watched intensified, especially at night when shadows seemed to stretch and move of their own accord. Sleep became a luxury, as they often lay awake, listening for any sign of the mysterious figure they had seen in their dream. The line between waking and dreaming blurred, and the protagonists started to question their own sanity. Were these events real, or were they the product of a mind pushed to the brink by fear? Despite their growing dread, the protagonist resolved to uncover the truth. They knew they could not continue living in a state of constant terror and uncertainty. Whether the source of their torment was supernatural or psychological, they needed to confront it. The strange occurrences were a call to action, a sign that something or someone was reaching out, and the protagonist was determined to find out why. As the strange occurrences continued, the protagonist's anxiety reached a fever pitch. The unseen presence in their home became more palpable, an oppressive force that seemed to follow them everywhere. The once comforting space of their apartment had transformed into a battleground between the known and the unknown, where shadows seemed to hold secrets and silence was laden with potential terror. One particularly chilling night, the protagonist was jolted awake by an intense feeling of being watched. The room was shrouded in darkness, yet the sensation of another presence was undeniable. It felt as though someone or something was standing just beyond the edge of their vision, observing them with an unsettling intensity. Paralyzed with fear, the protagonist lay still, straining to hear any sound that might confirm the presence of an intruder. But the silence was absolute, deepened only by the soft hum of the refrigerator in the distance. Summoning the courage to move, the protagonist reached for their phone to use as a flashlight. The faint glow illuminated the room, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Their heart pounded as they swept the light around the room, half expecting to catch a glimpse of the shadowy figure from their nightmares. But the room was empty, just as it had been during previous searches. The only evidence of the presence was the protagonist's own racing heartbeat and the cold sweat that had formed on their brow. Determined not to let fear control them, the protagonist sat up in bed, scanning the room with their phone's light. The feeling of being watched persisted, now accompanied by a subtle, almost imperceptible chill in the air. It felt as if the temperature had dropped, a cold spot enveloping the bed, making their breath visible in the faint light. The protagonists shivered, wrapping themselves in the blanket, but the cold seemed to seep into their very bones, a stark contrast to the warm summer night outside. As they sat in the dark, the protagonist's thoughts raced, What if the presence wasn't just a figment of their imagination? What if it was something more sinister, something that defied rational explanation? The research they had conducted flashed through their mind, stories of spirits, entities, and shadow people. Could it be that their apartment was haunted? The possibility, once dismissed as superstition, now felt disturbingly real. Lost in thought, the protagonist suddenly felt a weight pressing down on the bed beside them as if someone had just sat down. The mattress dipped slightly, and the protagonist's breath caught in their throat. They turned slowly, the phone's light trembling in their hand, but saw nothing. The indentation in the mattress remained, however, a physical manifestation of the presence that had plagued them. It was a moment that stretched into an eternity, filled with a tension so thick it felt like the air itself was constricting around them. Desperate to break the spell, the protagonists spoke aloud, their voice shaky and barely above a whisper. "Who's there?" The words hung in the air, unanswered, but the weight on the bed lifted, as if the presence had retreated. The cold dissipated, and the room returned to its usual temperature, but the protagonist's fear did not abate. They sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. The experience left them shaken, their mind reeling with questions and fears. Unable to sleep, the protagonist spent the rest of the night researching methods to deal with potential hauntings. They considered everything from sage smudging to contacting a paranormal investigator. The rational part of their mind struggled to assert control, searching for logical explanations. Perhaps it was stress, a sleep disorder, or even an overactive imagination. But the weight on the bed, the cold spot, and the intense feeling of being watched defied easy dismissal. By morning, the protagonist had made a decision. They couldn't continue living in fear, trapped in a home that felt increasingly like a prison. They resolved to confront the unseen presence, to seek answers and, if necessary, help. Whether the solution lay in psychological treatment or paranormal intervention, they were determined to reclaim their peace of mind and their life. The path ahead was uncertain, but the protagonists knew they could no longer avoid facing the terror that had upended their world. In a final bid to understand the strange occurrences, the protagonist sought the help of a paranormal investigator, someone reputed for their expertise in dealing with unexplained phenomena. They reached out with a mixture of skepticism and desperation, sharing the details of their experiences, the vivid nightmare, the open door, the strange occurrences, and the oppressive feeling of being watched. The investigator arrived one evening carrying equipment and a calm demeanor that provided a measure of reassurance. They conducted a thorough examination of the apartment, using devices to measure electromagnetic fields and thermal cameras to detect anomalies. The protagonist watched anxiously, their nerves taut, as the investigator moved from room to room, noting areas of interest. The kitchen, where the tapping sound had been heard, and the bedroom, with its cold spots and unexplained presence, drew particular attention. After several hours of investigation, the expert sat down with the protagonist to discuss their findings. They explained that while they had detected minor fluctuations in the electromagnetic fields, often associated with paranormal activity, these could also be attributed to faulty wiring or household appliances. However, the thermal camera had captured something more unusual: faint, unexplained cold spots in the bedroom, consistent with the protagonist's experiences. The investigator then shared historical data about the building. It had been constructed on the site of an old house, long since demolished. Rumors and local legends spoke of a tragedy. An occupant of the original house had died under mysterious circumstances, and their presence was said to linger. Though the investigator cautioned against jumping to conclusions, They suggested that the protagonist might be sensitive to these residual energies, possibly explaining their intense experiences. The protagonist felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The findings provided some validation of their experiences, but also raised more questions. If these events were linked to a past tragedy, what did it mean for them? Were they simply perceiving residual energy, or was there a conscious presence trying to communicate? The investigator offered to perform a cleansing ritual, a common practice to address unwanted energies. The protagonist agreed, hoping to find peace and clarity. As the ritual began, they watched as the investigator moved through the apartment, burning sage and chanting softly. The air seemed to thicken, the atmosphere charged with a palpable energy. The protagonist felt a weight lift from their shoulders, a lightness that had been absent for weeks. However, as the ritual neared its conclusion, something unexpected happened. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the lights flickered. The protagonist felt a familiar chill, the same oppressive presence they had felt many times before. The investigator paused, sensing the change. For a brief moment, it felt as though the air itself was alive, buzzing with an unseen force. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sensation dissipated, leaving the room eerily quiet. The investigator concluded the ritual, assuring the protagonist that they had done all they could. They advised keeping a journal of any further incidents and suggested seeking further spiritual or psychological support if needed. The protagonist, though grateful for the help, felt a lingering unease. The ritual had brought a sense of calm, but it also seemed to confirm the presence of something beyond the ordinary. In the days that followed, the protagonist noticed a marked decrease in strange occurrences. The oppressive feeling of being watched faded, and the cold spots disappeared. Life began to return to a semblance of normalcy, yet the memory of the experiences remained vivid. The protagonist continued to keep a journal, documenting their thoughts and any residual sensations, hoping to understand the full scope of what they had gone through. One evening, while reviewing their notes, the protagonist had a revelation. The experiences had forced them to confront their deepest fears and insecurities, laying bare vulnerabilities they had long ignored. Whether the events were supernatural or psychological, they had served as a catalyst for introspection and change. The protagonist realized that the true revelation was not just about the existence of the paranormal, but about understanding themselves, how fear can distort perception, how the mind seeks meaning in chaos, and how they could take control of their narrative. With this newfound perspective, the protagonist decided to take proactive steps to reclaim their life. They reached out to friends and family, seeking support and reconnecting with their social circle. They also explored therapy, wanting to ensure they were not overlooking any underlying psychological issues. In doing so, they began to rebuild their sense of safety and normalcy, learning to distinguish between real threats and imagined fears. The apartment, once a place of dread, became a symbol of resilience. The protagonist redecorated, adding personal touches that made the space feel like a true home. They installed new locks and invested in better security measures, not out of paranoia, but as a way to assert control over their environment. The nightmare and subsequent events had left an indelible mark, but they also paved the way for growth and understanding. In the end, the protagonist found peace not through the eradication of the unknown, but through the acceptance of it. They learned that some mysteries might never be fully explained, and that this was a part of life's complexity. The journey had been terrifying and disorienting, but it had also been transformative, teaching them about courage, resilience, and the power of facing one's fears head-on.